Well, so, you saw this industry and you saw that there were so many different neurofeedback tech platforms, just a mess of different software, hardware solutions. And you saw that neurofeedback tech is very complicated and brains are very complicated. And the first thing that came to your mind was, I'm going to build an app that lets people do this on their toilet.
Yeah, that wasn't where my starting point was, but sure, you can certainly do that. I mean, we really haven't explored the whole toilet market segment. Um,
Well, we're
yeah,
doing it. Over here at Trace Neuro, we are innovating and we're
amazing.
reclaiming toilet time from just being on YouTube to being on YouTube and training your brain.
Well, hey, you might as well. I mean, that's where we spend most of our screen time, from what I understand now, right?
Yeah,
uh,
I'm there all the time. I'm
that's a
there,
good one.
but more than I am in my office.
Oh my God.
Um, yeah. So, well, tell me, like, what was it? Why'd you start Divergence?
Well, it's really a long story. I'll try to make it really short. So around 2020, I was pretty depressed personally because the pandemic, also just a drastic change of everything, and coming to the realization that my life wasn't going to be about staying in front of Zoom calls for 12 hours a day, trying to decide how to reorg. So we can serve the capitalist overlords better. That wasn't really kind of my drive and my motivation. So, I became pretty depressed personally. To be honest, I went through a dark period. So I was looking for any kind of meaningful activities, meaningful things that we can invent, that we can proliferate to help millions of people like me that were stuck at home, having very little outside interaction other than, Zoom. And really, for the first time, some of us, in a lifetime, re-examining what it is they do every day and how that aligns to their purpose, right? So, and as a result, my conclusion was, wow, I really don't want to be doing this. So, after going through some reflection, and my co-founder Heather Hargraves reached out to me over the summer as I was just going through one of my depressing, sort of days. She said, "What? Are you still doing your neuro thing? Because I had a neurotech startup before. It wasn't mine. It was I was working as a CTO that used mobile EEG acquisition system plus AI and cloud-based machine learning and web tools to help people capture epileptic seizure episodes. So unfortunately, the company wasn't well funded and didn't really kind of get the commercial success that it perhaps was aiming for at the time. And the other thing was we were very early for market. This was 2016, 2017 era, right? So, she said, well, here's the thing. You remember that one time, in 2018, I showed up in your lab with my, Brainmaster system. So I said, of course, you mapped my brain and told me about my trauma and all my mental health risks. And how could I forget? She says, well, it turns out that like it's really hard to do that now. And I go, why is that? It was, people used to come to my clinic, and now clinics are shot, because of COVID. Um, I'm having to do this sort of on a road, like a traveling magician with my suitcase of tools. And she did have a very cool, rainbow suitcase packed with Brainmaster, packed with the amplifier, the laptop, the whole works, $25,000 hardware. Because, well, of course, this is kind of limiting, right? Because I have to drive, door to door and show up to people's garages if they want to do a session. It's just not viable. Do you think we can do something to help people, get the care that could really help them, especially around a time like now where everyone's stuck indoors and therapy became completely online. So that's the start of it. And I looked at it and I said, well, I mean, technically, why not? We have all the tools. You look around anything else in our life, whether it's multimedia, banking, commerce, entertainment, interpersonal relationships, or therapy. Everything has become online. We live off of these things that we were just joking about in the toilet, or elsewhere in our apartments or homes. So I don't see why we shouldn't be doing, therapy. We shouldn't be doing therapy augmentation or biofeedback and neurofeedback on mobile platforms, right? So that was the genesis of it all, and we quickly bantered around, what would this take? What would this look like? How would this help people? And instead of just kind of inventing something for the sake of inventing it, we asked ourselves, well, what are the challenges? What are the actual problems? Can you tell me some of the concrete problems that folks are facing in your industry? Because she was doing neurofeedback and in a therapeutic context. So I ask questions. It's just, well, number one, it's the device. It's they're old and they're archaic and expensive. And number two, it's the experience. It's you've got to have the wherewithal to manage 15, 20 windows at any given time and know all of them. And before you can even start pulling EEG, and this was really kind of a historical problem, right? So it's you've got a very nascent field that's dominated or pioneered by, and later dominated by a handful of players, right? And there wasn't enough momentum or general public recognition in order for it to get the oxygen it needed from the broader public, and there's just no very little understanding outside of the immediate, I would say ISNR circle, the neuroregulation neurofeedback circle. When we attended our first APA, American Psychology Association conference, I think between 2 to 3% of everybody we spoke with has some kind of understanding generally about what neurofeedback and neurotherapy was, and the other 98 were
Wow.
just like, what? So it's moved a long way, but I think the point I'm trying to make is the industry has been forced to look at the way they do things differently because of the pandemic in 2020 and onwards. But also, some of those problems that I noticed as very much an outsider. I didn't know neurofeedback from Hole in the Wall before 2018, and quickly been reading a lot about the practices, speaking with practitioners, clinical owners, and everybody that's involved in the value chain, and end users, clients. Everybody's seems to be like, there must be a better way of doing this, right? Like than having $20,000 gear hauled into an office or at your garage. Or on the other side, very very rudimentary, very kind of consumer level sort of hardware. There must be something in between those two extremities. Is sort of where we landed, right? So you've got to have something that holds up to clinical grade, that you can create protocols, you can have the nuance, and that has a good signal quality, that you can actually show the raw EEG and be like, hey, this holds up to clinical grade, without costing $25,000. So that was kind of where we landed. We were like, well, this industry really needed this tool, but beyond that, I think what's more is that the industry needed a different way of thinking. Instead of remote as an augmentation, perhaps think of remote as a means of delivery just as important as in clinic sort of therapy. I'm not advocating that remote can replace in clinic by any stretch of means when it comes to some of the more important nuanced things like QEEG assessment. It's hard to imagine that now, but I think there will be a time in the near future that becomes a reality. However, that was really the kind of point of inflection, as my observation would suggest, that when we started realizing as an industry, as a crowd of people start saying, hey, listen, there must be better tools, there must be better methods of delivering care, which is quite effective and really does make a difference in lives of a lot of people, instead of having to pull them into the office space and queue them up and force them to drive 25-30 minutes for a session that costs them $150, right? There must be something better than the baseline. So that was where our journey started, and we didn't know what that was. 2020 was like a lifetime ago. Looking back, so much has happened in the last 5 years, but the starting point of this was when I looked at neurofeedback and neuroregulations industry. I said, well, as an outsider, we've seen other industries undergoing similar technological innovation, curves of technological innovation, whether it is hardware, systems, algorithms, apps, anything that comprises a part of the system of delivering has undergone a similar technological innovation. I was working in transit technology before this, and I've noticed that, just a few years before I started Divergence, transit was undergoing a similar sort of innovation. Everything was moving from desktop to cloud to mobile to web. As newer generations of operators come online, they say, well, why do I have to work with Windows 98 or Windows XP? Like, good God, we grew up
Or
around.
Windows 11 for that matter.
Right, or
Like,
Windows 11, or any kind of Windows for that matter. Not that I'm bashing Windows, but we grew up around these things, right? So you've got younger operators, clinicians, or service providers in general that are like, well, what can I do this from my phone? What can I do this on my browser? What if I'm on a train? Do I have to haul my huge hard drive with me and hope everything's intact in C drive when I review QEEG or sessions done by my clients? Well, the answer is, well, you don't really. So we kind of just saw this as an opportunity to make something better for a whole bunch of people that are benefiting and that are providing neurofeedback as a therapy, and then that are benefiting from practices by well-trained clinicians. So that was the starting point of Divergence. And, we said when we do this, we wanted to really be close to clinicians, because the one thing that we looked at is, sure, there was a lot of tools around even 2020 that you can buy for $200-300 on Amazon that can help you, that claims to help you with different conditions, and with neurofeedback, with consumer grade hardware and software. And they do help, and I think some of them are great. But the reality of the matter is, those tools don't come close to the level of configurability, the level of customizability and sophistication that most of practicing clinicians like you yourself know. There's a lot of nuance when it comes to setting up the right protocol. You have to base that off of a legitimate assessment. There's 20, 30 data points to be interpreted in any given assessment. So it's not as if we can just pretend that, there's a one size fits all. You just buy this toy and go home and listen to some sound waves and like that will solve everybody's problem. But what the industry needed was a platform, an organization that really talks to the providers, understands their pain point, understands how it is that they're working, and what are the pain points that technology can resolve. Is not to sort of replace the human element in there, so to speak. So that was kind of our modus operandi when we started it, and this still is. We wanted to try to make the job of human clinicians, operators better, instead of coming from the angle of let's build something that just bypass the human altogether. I don't believe that works.
yeah,
And it probably won't work for a while yet, because you'll really look at the degree of AI and automation. It's very rudimentary right now. It can help us do certain things, but by no means comes to close to replacing the very important human element in the loop. So we thought, hey, why don't we set our goals very realistically? And that goal is to make the jobs of clinicians better, so that they can deliver care, right? That they know how to deliver, they're trained to deliver in a way that is more scalable, more tenable, from cost perspective, and that can help them scale their impact broadly into the community without having to be restricted by the four walls of their clinic and a schedule, right? So that was really why we kind of took on this very weird, interesting problem in space.
yeah.
Yeah, I've learned so much in the past 5 years. It's still learning. Yeah.
And how did this change your experience of doing neurofeedback? Right, you mentioned that it's like you were feeling depressed, struggling, and also starting to gain some insight into what's happening in your brain. Did you start doing neurofeedback with the Divergence platform, or how has that evolved over time?
Yeah, great question. And I did. That's a short answer. But I also did neurofeedback with a lot of other platforms. Right when Heather first met me in 2018, I think Brainmaster, Brain Avatar was what we were playing with, and since then we've tried, 4 or 5
Sorry,
different systems.
Alex. Could you start again? Something changed with your microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry. Maybe my network was being weird. Well, I was saying
It just
that
got a little quieter.
okay, let me see if there's a configuration for noise cancellation. I don't know. I didn't touch anything. Um, is this better now? I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. Yeah, so as I was saying, I certainly did on the Divergence system, but before that, I started with different systems that are really kind of like standard clinical systems, like BrainMaster, Brain Avatar, for example, was definitely the first system I did any neurofeedback, with the help of Heather on myself. We did a QEEG brain map, was a 19 channel wet cap. I remember this very well, and was the desktop Brain Avatar software. So, um, since then we've tried probably a handful of other systems from very expensive to very affordable, and everything sort of in between. And when the first generation of Divergence platform came out, the Dive app, which I think was June 2021, which was our first ISNR attendance remotely, I did probably about 80 to 100 hours of testing on my own brain using our first generation partner hardware, which at the time was just the Neurosity Crown, which is a wonderful device. Had 8 channels, and I was doing lots of alpha up in the back and SMR in midbrains because it had all the channel coverage and a little bit of parietal alpha down, sort of just enhance focus. And I've started to notice difference weeks in where I used a very short attention span, very short temper and fuse, where something doesn't go my way, I became very reactive very quickly, and I've noticed that change in myself just within the first year of really seriously making a habit of doing these protocols that I knew were beneficial to regulating my brain, self-regulating. And obviously, since the release of the first generation, I'm the chief testing officer in Divergence. I test every build before it launches. We've had probably 50 launches since 50 or 60, somewhere around there, in the 5 years since we first launched 1.0. So, I've done a lot of neuro, and I noticed the changes of how that affected particularly my reactivity and my sort of temper, and really helped regulate my mood in a lot of times where things got really challenging. So, yeah, I regularly use neuro. I had a very sort of pivotal moment in 2018 in terms of getting that QEG, and Heather started telling me, wow, you've got these barriers between your default mode network and salience network that shows up in very high alpha and around parietal regions. So you're kind of a space cowboy, and you know, um, like I'm just looking at her going, I don't know you from Adam, woman. What magic is this? Like, and also I want to know more. So it's sort of like that. That's how I started it all, because it really kind of was experiential. My first experience was somebody looking at my brain map, going, yeah, I think you might identify with some of these challenges. Without a single question, right? Like without a single survey or questionnaire, and none of that. I, I think if my own experience can serve as any sort of data point, it's just N01 for now. But it really certainly did work for me, to help me sort of become more even keeled, have a lot more patience. Part of this is growing as well, so that's a confounding variable. But really kind of change my reactivity in a big noticeable way. So absolutely.
Yeah, that experience of having your QEEG and then someone sort of not reading your life story per se, but kind of describing like really fundamental elements of your day to day and just being like, "What? How the fuck did you know that about me?"
Exactly. It was black magic, basically. Yeah, to
And then
me,
it's like,
anyways.
well, we can do something about it. And then the training starts. And I think a lot of people experience a sense of wonder that we can know that much about someone's experience based on their QEEG. And then it's like, well, but does the training technology actually work? And how quickly does it work? So, how did you manage your expectations doing the training, and how did it meet or differ from your expectations as far as how quickly you would like see a benefit or a change?
Well, it's an interesting question because if I were to be 100% honest, I didn't know what my expectations were. I've always been a skeptic. Look, I had a very classical engineering training, computer science, and then business. Um, I think I stayed as far away as I could, for the most part, from any of the fringier sort of health wellness sort of trends, right? So, to be honest with you, I had no idea what to expect. Having said that, I think it's really interesting uh, to notice the changes as I started, doing these things experientially. What happens when I dial my attention inward, session by session, to really focus on that space, on my breathing, instead of just, allowing the 20,000 thoughts kind of run my head. That's normally my mode. Um, I notice a change of immediately the music volume and the screen brightness. So these are cues that my brain was responding to, unbeknownst to me, and certainly wasn't intentional. It was completely like a thing that was just happening in my brain, but I could notice it. So this goes on. So when you repeat something like a skill you're learning n number of times, and state becomes trait, right? That's how operant conditioning works with certain reward paradigms. So I was acquiring skills of self-regulation, of focusing on my breathing, focusing on internal senses rather than external distractions, without really having some psychologist telling me, well, if you do this, and it's like you can rewire your brain, no CBT, right? So, I can notice the changes happening to me, in short term, and then over time, these skills become somewhat innate. Like I would remember sitting in the same traffic, the one that I drive to work and back, 3, 4 times a week. I used to get mad if somebody cuts me off or don't let me in, merge. And there's certain intersections where you just kind of you can feel your muscles tense, and your shoulders just kind of like lifts, and everything becomes tense. What I do now is I go back to my little breathing exercise, and I start doing my, sort of RSA breathing, and everything becomes very just cool. I just let it happen. So, so that was one of the most noticeable changes. And also, the other noticeable change for me is when somebody gives me less than ideal news, like, oh, this feature isn't going to be done this day, which happens all the time. It's part of life of software. Something always happens, right? So you think you're going to have it next week. No, you're not. But I used to react to those news, and go into this sort of like reactive tailspin. Now I just kind of, okay, well, what's the mitigation? What do we need to do? And how do we how do we adjust expectation of our customers? I go into this very kind of matter of factual, operational mode, instead of getting reactive or emotional about it. So I think that's the other noticeable change that I've noticed in myself. Yeah.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And the skeptic in me would then say, well, you've had these changes, but how do we know that it's not because you're spending whatever, just 20 minutes a day trying to be sort of more mindful, right? Like, and is it possible for us even to kind of separate out what's happening with the brainwave training side of things versus this sort of like practicing of more kind of like conscious mindfulness skills?
Yeah, that I don't have the answer to that, and I think you raise a very good point. Is what about the confounding factors? What about that just being part of growing up, or maturing, or getting old, or whatever? The truth of the matter is, I don't know. I can't tell you that that's 100% because I've started doing neuro, but what I will say is that neuro, to me, and to many savvy practitioners, is just another tool, right? So like you've got different tools on your tool belt. When it comes to cognitive nervous system or autonomous nervous system, there are many different tools that we can use. HRV, breathing, galvanic skin response, body temperature, all the sort of stuff. You name it. These are just tools. They themselves don't help make you better. It's the conscious and intentional use of the tools with a purpose. That's what moves the dial, right? So it's not about, all right, well, I'm just doing this stuff just kind of because I think I should, or I make a tool for other people to use. And I have to understand their experience, but I really do think that these kind of experiences that you experience, if they're desirable, like calm, um sort of non-reactivity, no one likes to get worked up, not even people that gets worked up every hour. They don't like the feeling of being worked up, so your body knows, right? So it's not about again having a very overeducated psychologist telling you, well, you really try to, like, not all that CBT stuff. It's about steering your body towards a desirable state that it knows is desirable and optimal, and then trying to coax it with data and information, or reward better off. So it happens sort of on its own, but it's only a tool. Um, Randomized feedback doesn't really do much. We've had lots of peer-reviewed literature showing that randomized feedback isn't really effective, as opposed to controlled and well-crafted feedback. So, all to say, there's no surefire way, but I think if experience is of any guide, along with other life habits that have been changing for me, neuro is definitely part of that journey of kind of understanding my cognitive and autonomous nervous system reactions a bit more, and being able to fine tune that. So I don't think it's the only thing. I think that would be presumptuous, but I also think that it did help bringing that awareness to what my body and my brain is doing, by making it front and center, right? So I think that's sort of the role I see, technology broadly, and neurotherapy specifically having in people's lives. If we can bring this awareness to more people, so that at least they see the thing they're doing, and then they can see how they can go into a more desirable, more optimal state, by like not doing that or doing something else, that presents an opportunity, presents a exciting sort of potential for them to say, hey, I don't have to be this way. I don't have to react every time somebody gives me a piece of bad news, or get mad every time somebody cuts me off on the highway. That's what this is about.
Yeah, and it's a great example of something that I think almost everyone can relate to, right? As far as mental health or just subjective experience kind of struggle, right? It's just like, hey, let's not lose our shit today. And
Yeah.
then people are like, okay, it has to do with your brain. So like, but what can it treat, right? Like, can it fix my ADD, or can it fix my sister's, sleep problem? So how do you approach that question of like, does it treat X?
Yeah. So look, I'm not the most qualified person to answer that, though. My background is software engineering, and I read a lot of literature about neuro. What I will say from my experience, again, and from speaking with and working with a lot of really qualified therapists, such as yourself, who actually have credentials around this stuff, is that we have to distinguish between two concepts: treating from a medical sense, which is having benchable results, make something better, that is a clinical diagnosis, versus self-improvement, right? So it's important to understand the role of, when we say neurofeedback, a lot of that, as I've just described, was self-improvement. So, of course, you can use it as a tool to augment interventions, along with other forms of interventions, or just on its own. But I think when it comes to treating something, I think there's a danger of misconception on, first of all, the entire field of psychology over pathologizing so-called diseases, right? So take ADHD as an example. There's a diagnosis of ADHD in DSM-5. Obviously, there's subgenres of ADHD. When you kind of look under the hood, there's the anxious types, inattentive, there's slow cortical potential, just to name a few. But I think it's perhaps worth asking the question: what exactly is the intent? Is the intent as it was, 40, 50 years ago, or to lead to a simple prescription of a chemical intervention, specifically Ritalin or Vyvanse or one of these drugs in a clinical sense to then send the patient home with, or was the intention to understand why something arises and what part of the brain is showing the signs of dysregulation, and what ultimately causes it, right? So, take ADHD for example, because I like ADHD as an example. This is very relatable. Um, you know, the environment is something that not a lot of people look at. The environment where kids grow up today, or all of us are kind of immersed in, we've got messages coming at us every minute, every second. We've got, 5, 10 times the number of things that we have to process every day, compared to say 20, 30 years ago. Our parents' generation, they need to do that one job, and it's very well defined. And now it's like, you're running a podcast while doing some QEG scan and thinking about the marketing newsletter and talking to 5 customers. It's like, whoa, 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 because of the proliferation of technology and interconnectivity, it's brought us wonderful spoils of ease of communication, but it's also brought us this tremendous pressure of feeling like we always have to be responding, we always have to be plugged in, we always have to be processing information, making decisions. You think of how long it takes something like the frontal cortex to develop. That's hundreds of thousands of years just as part of Homo sapien journey, not counting anything before. 450,000 years is Homo sapiens. The frontal cortex really started emerging, in the middle, sort of later half of that. And you wanted it to do all the things that we're throwing ourselves into and expect that we will have perfect attention on everything that we're doing. How? Right? That's a hardware software issue. It's like running, the latest Windows 11 on a 386 or 486. There's probably before your day, as I'm saying this, was 8 MB of RAM, right? So you'd just be ludicrous to expect that you could even get it to install, right? So that's a bit of an extreme example, but what I'm trying to demonstrate here is I don't think that over pathologizing, over diagnosing is the answer here, and I think a lot of what you see as expressions of ADHD or symptoms are symptoms of maladaptiveness. So, in other words, individuals struggling to meet the demand of an environment that has drastically changed from what the baseline used to be 20, 30 years ago, right? I think Jonathan Haidt wrote in his famous book that I just finished reading last year called The Anxious Generation. Really good book if anyone wants to know the technology's role in creating massive expressions of anxiety over the last 15 years. And he cherry picked this generation, I think, that was sort of born between 2005 to 2015. He calls it the anxious generation. And explore single-hand, like sort of just this role of technology, the smartphone particularly, played in these kids' life. One of the things he says, well, the brain hasn't caught up in its physiological development and biological development. We don't have this extra part that can just multitask willy-nilly because we have to now. So sort of like, you've got the environmental requirement flying way ahead of its sort of biological foundation and hardware. How could you not expect dysregulation? How could you not expect, misalignment or sort of just maladaptiveness behavior, right? Like, of course you're going to have maladaptive behavior because it's impossible for a majority of us to adapt to such drastic environmental changes over a single generation. What it used to take, hundreds, even thousands of generations to accomplish, right? We can't just upgrade the hardware of the brain. The best we can do is to change our reaction patterns or reactive patterns to the environment to regulate our brains to form new patterns instead of being reactive. But I think as much as there is a point to be made in diagnosis. There are, of course, people who do unfortunately suffer from some kind of deeper level chemical imbalance and dysregulation. That is 100% a reality. It is just not the whole picture. So a lot of that, we have to be very careful when we kind of look at diagnosis, fixing or curing any of that vernacular versus self-regulating. A lot of the issues can be improved, or expressions or life quality can be improved by self-regulation. However, it's not 100%. It would never be 100%. There'll always be cases where, chemical interventions are warranted, and they are the right approach, in the case of things like depression or severe anxiety. But that is not, as far as I understand, the majority, especially with this wave of self-diagnosing. Oh, I'm ADHD, I'm this, I'm that. It's like, no, you're exhibiting maladaptive patterns because you haven't adjusted to, the environment that puts all this demand on you, or actually sit down and figured out what you need to fine tune in terms of your response pattern, right? So, not everything is a hardware issue.
Well, and it's interesting because I also recommend, Jonathan Haidt's book, but, the sort of devil's advocate would say, well, if the problem is that we're on our screens all the time and that we're addicted to social media and that we're watching YouTube all the time, then isn't the solution just to take a step back and get into nature, And
Yes, always.
and to me, I'm a yes and, right? It's like, let's do both, right? Obviously, we have to engage in a certain kind of hygiene with our digital environment so that we're not constantly getting burned out. And we can also utilize neurotechnology, both neurofeedback, which is active when you're also looking at a screen, and neurostimulation and, heart rate variability to help address the imbalances that causes to our brains, right? And so you're talking about ADD as an example. And, one sort of phenotype we have for ADD is where someone has their anterior cingulate, sort of like this salience network, this part of the brain that is responsible for helping us shift modes to focus on something or to block out another distraction. That's heavily involved in our dopamine processes. So when you're, scrolling, or when you're engaged in something that's like super tantalizing, or watching porn, or, shopping online, or, something very stimulating in that sense, it's engaging our anterior cingulates in a way that we never had before. We never had such, sort of sensually, like appealing information constantly at our disposal. And so, yes, part of the problem is that we have this constant overstimulation of that area. And part of the equation is to just sort of become more mindful and ideally not depend on that kind of stimulation quite so much. And the other piece is that, with neurotechnology, we literally can target and strengthen that area of the brain as if it were a muscle, because it is a part of our physiology that utilizing EEG, biofeedback, and other forms of biofeedback, we can tap into our innate neuroplasticity, which means we're not going to be evolving our brain like we would, that took hundreds of thousands of years from like a genetic standpoint. But there are still the genetic mechanisms to engage neuroplasticity and fundamentally bolster the metabolic capacity of that brain area, which then translates to people being able to, sit with themselves in difficult situations and not reach for the phone to check into, whatever it is. We all have our ways of kind of checking out from the present moment. So, I mean, it's interesting, right, that we've come up with a tech solution for a problem that in a lot of ways I think is driven by tech.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? It's a bit of a full circle moment. I don't know if you've ever read anything written by Matthew Ridley, fairly prominent journalist, right around late 90s, early aughts. One of the things he focused on in later half his career was this idea of evolution. He wrote all these books It's called one of his books is called The Agile Gene, and then the sequel for it's called The Red Queen. So the Red Queen obviously borrows from Alice in Wonderland. When the queen moves on a board, the board moves with her. So it's sort of like making a very topical kind of allusion to the sort of symbiotic effect of evolution, where you have your organisms evolving along with an environment that's also evolving and changing at the same time. So what you just kind of talked about in terms of all these additional demands and distractions or concentrated sort of overstimulation, overloading of stimuli that's just overwhelming every nerve in your system, because your system is just not designed or evolved to handle that kind of stimulation, right? I mean, no human being for the last 99.999% of our existence needed to deal with that, right? They're out there on a savanna, and they're kind of like, okay, so saber-toothed tiger, that's like, okay, maybe like 5% of the time they had to deal with that, and the other 95 were something more, low density information, low density stimuli. So, you know, um, as evolution will have it, in Ridley's book, he talks about the sort of organism's capability to evolve with the environment. So when it comes to us, that is quite literally using technology to help us get better at exercising that right piece of muscle. Right. Of course, everyone can go work out. We all know this. Is all you need is some space and a couple of weights, and away you go. But or just hit the pavement, and anyone can run, so long as you have healthy legs. But that's not optimization. Optimization is understanding where you should be at in terms of your heart rate. To what distance do you want to accomplish, right? You're not going to run a 5K the same way you run a marathon. You're never going to finish. Well, how do you distinguish that? Well, you can be very good at tuning into what your muscles are saying, or your breathing and your heart rate. These are data that helps make the job a lot easier for the brain when it comes to a quick decision. Am I going too hard? Am I not going hard enough? Or am I just right? And that is what we're talking about when it comes to biofeedback as a whole, right? Of course, anyone can sit there under a tree to meditate, or be in nature for that matter. But that doesn't guarantee that, most of us are going to reach that sort of state of optimal sort of brainwave balance, right? How do we really know? We don't, unless we measure. That's the answer, right? So you can spend years and get very good at transcendental meditation. Check yourself in a monastery, go through the practice and process, and that's absolutely effective in most cases. But it does require the kind of time investment that most of us can't afford in modern lives. I can't just go to a monastery for 4 weeks because I want to be Zen. Like, there's a very real price to pay for that. My business will suffer, my customers will suffer, my relationships and other things will suffer. So, the more pragmatic solution, as we've stumbled upon through this wonderful process of evolution, is, well, how do we turn this thing on its head? How do we use technology for good? Because it turns out you can use technology for good, right? So you can bring about better understanding by looking at the right data. You can do education, such as what you've been doing, and this is wonderful work you're doing, is talking about this stuff in a general public context, using languages everybody can understand, right? And I think the more people understood what something meant, the more they're going to look at it, and it's just a framing, it's a narrative, it's a metric, right? Like heart rate itself, 30 years ago, if you were to tell me that we're all going to walk around with something that measures our heart rate on the back of our wrist, I'd be like, you're crazy. That's like, runners spend $300-400 to buy a really piece of expensive watch, so that they can track their heart rate when they're running marathon. That's a very specific application, and that's why it's costing, hundreds of dollars, because it's not mass production yet. Garmin was, I think, the first one, Polar and Garmin. late 90s, early aughts. And then you've got, Fitbit entering into the game, and that really tipped the scale in terms of what is the narrative around heart rate and heart rate variability. All of a sudden, before you know it, people start talking about body batteries after they sleep. And it's like, all the HRV repackaged, right? It's sort of like HRV is nothing new. I mean, HRV has been around, this since what, mid 50s and late 50s, early 60s. So, it's taken time from something that is biometrically relevant to come from the labs of physiology to everyday language, right? 20 years ago, when you ask people what is a sleep score, they're going to look at you like you're crazy, unless they work at, a polysomnography lab, right? So in that case, it's a whole report. But we can do that at home now, thanks to technology.
And even some of
That's,
those aren't that good at
yeah,
sleep scoring.
right. I
Not to
mean,
throw
look,
shade.
yeah, look, it's well, I kind of cherry picked that as an example because this is something to me. Body battery is made it into gem pop vernacular, right? When you ask most people what's your body battery, they kind of know what you mean if they're kind of savvy, 20 to 40 something that
Or
own
your
a
readiness score,
smartwatch.
something like that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So I think if anything, I'm sure of is that a lot of the stuff that you and I are talking about in terms of anterior cingulate theta beta, SMR, and these vernacular will become popular vernacular one day, just in a slightly different framing. It's like they might not call it TBR or SMR, they might call it something else like attention score, right? So you're seeing this come out in the Gen Pop, and that pushes everybody to adopt this, or kind of just incentivizes them to adopt this as a language, as a thing that can bring awareness to the real thing, which is what am I really feeling, right? Like articulating affective, qualitative feelings aren't always the easiest to a lot of people. Having a language really does help in that sense.
Yeah. And, early on, you were talking about how the sort of awareness and adoption is so small within the general sort of domain of psychology. And I agree that it is fundamentally a language challenge because we have, our basic English language where we're capable of talking about our emotions and our experiences and the different, states we are in. And that's recruiting a particular part of the brain that we know is itself, networked to other areas of the brain. And there's some limitations to the, what we can describe with our language and also what we can be aware of, like consciously, as far as how our inner experience is changing. But also from a therapeutic standpoint, there's limitations to the types of results that talk therapy can produce, right? Um, you know, there's value in almost any situation, but we don't expect a talk therapist to, reduce the amount of seizures that someone is experiencing. You might expect that, a good course in neurofeedback could reduce the amount of seizures that someone is having. Now, we're not going to say that this treats a medical condition. You can go up in the literature and look at some of the case studies and some of the, Walker. But, with neurofeedback, we have an access point to different forms of network dysfunctions and network functions too, right? We don't want to just put in the pathological model. We want to talk about there's different areas of the brain that help us do certain things that we just don't have access to with some of the other modalities with as much specificity. And I'd say the same thing applies to meditation, right? Meditation, it's gone mainstream. I got into it before it was cool. um,
Yeah.
but there's an element to meditation that I think a lot of people find profoundly discouraging, right? I think there's people with severe trauma who have been trying to get meditation to work forever, and it just kind of feels like another nail in the coffin that they're never going to experience peace again. um, and I come across these people. I'm in meditation circles. I have a meditation group, and people take it as like a personal defect that they're not able to experience a certain type of subjective state with a particular, instruction, whether it be, Vipassana style or, transcendental meditation. I'm hoping to bring Locke Kelly onto the program. He talks about this a little bit. He's sort of from the non-dual tradition. And again, it's not to throw meditation under the bus. Love all the different advancements that we have. You can download the Waking Up app and get access to some of the greatest meditation teachers in the world, for $10, whatever it is. But for a lot of people, there's actually a physiological reason why you can't meditate. If you close your eyes and your brain has a programmed fear response where you're making less alpha waves, you will not be able to meditate no matter how hard you try. And it's like, there's no problem with trying something, right? You have to invest time to get something. But it's like, is that really a great use of people's time if all they're going to get is more of the same? And, so my message would be, if you are trying a particular modality, whether it's drugs, pharma, psychiatry, or these other sort of wellness techniques, like you were saying earlier, this is a tool that can potentially help us identify a particular area where things are not communicating like they could be. And then if it works for the person, to start actually training it. And it's a really liberating experience to know that it's not like some inherent defect, but it's just happens to be that your brain is stuck in a pattern.
Yeah, 100%. I think that was a very astute way of framing it. Is it's not, just something that there's nothing that works for everybody. Let's get something straight first. In order to deliver responsible cure, this is something I've learned from my therapist friends. You must meet every client where they are, to tell them that because they can't do a thing, there's something wrong with them, or to make them feel that way would be a disservice, right? Because all that's going to do is just get them discouraged. And it's like, well, why can I do this? There's something broken in me. Fortunately, I know more folks that meet people where they are than I know the other way around, where you're like, you must do this or else you're a failure. That's kind of going out of style for good reasons. But I want to talk about measurement for a second here, because I think the value of neuro, to me at least, is not just there's a tool that we can used to sort of regulate our brain by rewarding good behavior and not rewarding lesser desirable behavior. It goes more than that. It's really that Control Alt Delete, task monitor, where it shows you here, look, you've got all this high beta around your cingulate or anterior cingulate. Of course, you feel tired when you're engaged with demanding tasks, because that's where all your energies go, and it saps literally 70% of your resources. It's like a broken process, in computer language and in computer programming language, that's sucking up all your RAM and CPU cycle. And then when you're trying to run other useful applications that you're doing, it's getting no CPU or RAM cycle, because it's all drained by the broken process that just can't be killed. It's not doing particularly anything helpful, right? So amygdala upregulation is a biological function. We all know this. 100,000 years ago, back in the savannah, your amygdala has to upregulate and produce norepinephrine at the first sign of trouble, or else you're out of the gene pool. But fast forward to today. There are very few, there are very few scenarios where it actually does require your amygdala to go up like this and then pump your every muscle in your body with norepinephrine and pump your heart with blood and it sends your heart rate off the roof. There are very few scenarios that actually warrant this. Other scenarios are wired behaviors or trained behaviors that basically elicit a similar feeling of danger. That sends our amygdala up in a loop, right? So, those are not biologically perhaps warranted as much as they are sort of behavioral. So those are the situations where I think it does really help somebody to see their assessment. We have our assessment, of course, on Divergence called TheraQ. So it's a reduced version It's not a full cube, but it's a reduced version that focuses on 23 essential biomarkers that tie to things like cognitive processing, stress, trauma, sleep, emotional regulation. So the core essential metrics that you can gauge the uh, risks or status of operation of your brain, right? So when you see, like you said, there's that lack of alpha production in posterior, O1 was eyes closed. Anything below 50% up from eyes open does signify that there may be issues that warrants further investigation, right? So why can't your posterior produce more than 50% alpha when you close your eyes? Maybe there's a reason that is biological. Maybe you have concussion, or maybe you have chronic stress that stem from some kind of deeply seated trauma that rewired your autonomous nervous system, and that's sending signal through the vagal nerve to your brain, and then your amygdala can't calm down. Maybe that's the reason. Assessment doesn't always tell you concisely every reason of what causes the symptom, but it shows at least there's something going on there, right? It's like taking your car to the mechanic, where you have a very skilled mechanic, revs the engine, listens to it on every gear, and goes, okay, on 3 and 4 you're like way high, there's something wrong with your gearbox, we're gonna have to focus on the gearbox. That's what that is to me. It's not causatory, it's relational. But this is why we advocate a relational framework. Understanding just symptoms alone isn't sufficient, because you don't understand which area of the brain is actually showing signs of anomaly, a signs of dysregulation. That's why a combined approach must always be taken when assessing anybody, whether it's sort of wellness or diagnostic. And it's astonishing to me that we don't even get our teeth filled without some sort of scan, like an x-ray, to find out where the cavities are, and yet we're okay going to a provider to get a prescription or some kind of intervention without any kind of concrete biological data serving as evidence of where the dysregulation comes from. My big question is, well, how do you really know, right? It's I think science technology has evolved from the first version of DSM, and so must ways of assessment and ways of diagnosing in general. But that's my broad pitch on using data. There's a huge element of assessment for me, and not to mention when you throw brain maps in front of clients. Whether at a medical capacity or just a wellness sort of life coaching or training capacity, the reaction you get, it's something else, because the person is looking at the thing that's in their brain that's contributing to the behavior, and it externalizes this notion that there's something wrong with me. It's just the thing that my brain is doing, right? Let's say you step off the diamond, you bang your knee funny on a base. You're not gonna say, well, there's something wrong with me, I banged my knee, so I'm walking funny, not because there's something wrong with me, because I banged my knee against the base. That's but people don't do the same thing when it comes to their brain. There's something that your brain is doing that's causing all these extra work that's burning you out faster. That's why you have no energy most of the time. That's why you have a very short fuse. That's not saying that there's something necessarily wrong with you. This is how your brain got to this point, and we can undo that by rehabilitating it through physiological means, just as we can rehabilitating a broken knee through physiological needs or muscles.
Yeah, I got prescribed Adderall by a psychiatrist with zero investigation to what's actually going on in my brain, which is the norm. And sometimes it's not even a conversation. Sometimes it's just like, oh, you just have trouble focusing. Okay, here you go. And again, I'm not trying to throw, traditional medicine under the bus. And there's folks who are doing really good work in psychiatry. And Lord knows I couldn't be a psychiatrist. But um, so I started taking Adderall, and its main effect was just in kind of revving me up and making me more anxious, but not really helping me get more stuff done or like prioritize, and just being edgy, so starting to get a short
Mhm.
fuse. And had I gotten a brain map and had someone good look at it prior to getting my prescription, anyone could have predicted that outcome. I have a fast alpha, and Adderall speeds it up, and I have a lot of
Yeah,
frontal theta, and
that's okay.
turns out Ritalin's better for that. And lo and behold, it is, at least for my own, for my particular brain. Um,
Yeah.
and so, there's a lot of people who try medication who have a particular diagnosis, and it doesn't work the first time, or even the second or the third time. And it's like, well, I'm just stuck, and there's just something wrong with me. And exactly like you're saying, doing QEEG, brain mapping, or, with even a sort of more streamlined approach like the TheraQ, it gives us a way for looking at the system where it's less heavy, where it's less pejorative, where it's less like there's something wrong with me. And we can start to understand it from a network systems perspective, where, yes, there's certain areas that are having difficulty recruiting, but just like they got stuck in that habit, we have the ability to shift our habits, to exercise it so that we can move in a different direction. Um, and also to make different decisions in collaboration with healthcare providers, and certainly I'm starting to do much more of that work of, helping psychiatrists, neurologists understand what's going on from the QEEG perspective to help them do their jobs better. So obviously, like, I'm all for the collaboration, and I'm all for individuals, just starting to see more of the picture so that it feels less of like a life sentence when you get a diagnosis.
Yeah, yeah, and kudos to you. That I mean, there's so many layers in what you just said, right? I mean, I agree. No one's suggesting let's throw the baby out with the bathwater, and there's a lot of positive effects and efficacy on most of these drugs. The question is how we apply them. How much nuance do we have in this sort of like diagnostic triaging process? How do we prognostically predict the effect based on different brain types, right? So um, I think Martijn Arns a couple of years ago released a really interesting paper when it comes to sort of prognostic effects on EEG. This just came to mind. Um, when we are in Susan, I think you were there, and he was talking about different markers and prognostic power of these markers as it pertains to depression without epileptic markers or epileptiform EEG versus depression with epileptiform EEG. And the particular examples he was drawing is between citalopram and sertraline. One is an anticonvulsive, and the other is just a straight up antidepressant. So both work similarly, except for sertraline, when applied with epileptiform, is that much more effective in terms of pushing the remission rate higher because you're addressing the underlying epileptiform. But you would never be able to pick that out had you not done an EEG, right? Like it's just like most epileptiform or absent, which means absent of any kind of visible reaction. Um, so it's not going to show up on a survey. And of course, I'm cherry picking here. So, I'm all for integration. I'm all for advocating wider use of tools that are really biological in nature or physiological in nature that shows the decision makers, the care providers, what's really underneath the hood, right? Underneath the behavioral layer. Now, something about, whether sort of like QEEG or more streamlined approach. And I think one thing that I've noticed is, within a QEEG approach, it's all established around the standard deviation or Z-score from what is considered normal in a corpus of data sampled across, normal population, divided by age category, by gender, sometimes geography, but mostly age and gender. You know, here's kind of an interesting nugget to think about, right? So you just mentioned that you have fast alpha. I happen to have fast alpha too. My alpha is like 12 point something, 12.5 or something like that, even outside of the alpha range. But when you look at my peak alpha, that's sort of where it peaks out. But here's the thing, for the most part, that like works for me. So I don't want to, align to normal where around my age cat is sort of like, I think 10 or 10.5. I will feel sluggish to slow. I like being fast, for the most part. But, how do I understand if there's something really going wrong with me and my brain, as it pertains to, let's say, neurodegenerative or mild cognitive impairment? Let's say if I had an accident, bang my head against something. How do I know that there's an impact? Do I compare myself to normal? Because if I went from, let's say, 12.5 down to 10.5, I'm still well aligned to normal, right? So 10.5, it ain't bad, on posterior, but is that normal for me, right? So there's a question about, broader sense of normal as per QEEG, and there's a sense of ipsative, sort of comparing against your own baseline kind of normal. And I think this topic perhaps does deserve a little bit of investigation or attention being paid. And I think just looking at how you are, as one single snapshot against average population normal perhaps isn't sufficient. It's an excellent starting point, but establishing a trend line in your own brain, even with as few as 4 or 5 channels and 20-25 data points, that goes a long way. Because if my peak alpha has been at 12.5 or whatever for a while, and all of a sudden it dips to 10, well, that's still not bad normally. Something is definitely going on, right? Like you know what I'm talking about. It's like, okay, you don't just go from 12.5 to 10. Either you've like completely not slept well the night before, or you're on some sort of drugs that slows down your fast alpha, or your brain is going through something. That's a red flag. So yeah, I think part of the mission of what we're trying to do, aside from just aligning to population normal, is to provide a baseline that's longitudinal by making these technologies so affordable, the practice is so standardized and customizable, based on the therapist's wisdom and knowledge of intervention. We can make it so easy to do weekly or biweekly, sort of, or semi-weekly check-ins on essential brain state. So you create this longitudinal baseline, and then you can look at your own baseline and see, if something is out of whack, right? For every protocol that somebody does on Divergence right now, we're giving them peak alpha, for instance, not just in form of a measurement, just a regular protocol. So they can always see, in a context of a session, okay, have I gone up? Have I gone down? Or something, was one session completely out of whack, or something else? But that's just one example. So I think there's something important to be said about comparing against your own baseline and just building up your own baseline.
Yeah.
That's what enables, individualized medicine. That's what enables personalized medicine, right?
Yeah, there's grown to be something of a religion around normative databases in the quantitative EEG world. And of course, they have value because, we can understand where someone sits relative to a norm, in a way that can help us. But, I obviously there are vested interests in selling database comparisons. This new QEG standards document came out saying that you should do database comparisons. And, it's worrying to see that there's such a push towards essentially training everyone towards normal and towards making everyone's brain part of, like, essentially a software as a service, data harvesting element. And that's why I think it's important to, I'm going to plug myself, like, get connected with someone who understands brain dynamics, who isn't just going to say, oh, your alpha is faster or slower than the norm, therefore we must train it towards the norm. And I'll echo what you said. It's like, yes, in cases of severe pathology, understanding norms is helpful because we can train someone in the right direction. But you don't really need norms to know what's going on with the brain. And what's more important is actually helping someone reach their goals and understanding how their different EEG phenomenology corresponds to that. And part of my service is that we do functional neuroimaging using at least 19 channels every month. Because if you're paying to be doing training, we want to be seeing that you're getting the actual results that you're looking for. And of course, sometimes the brain just changes and it's not actually changing in the direction we're changing it. We're training it because all sorts of stuff is happening in the person's life. They're starting to sleep better. Their, sister died, they changed medications, like all sorts of different things are happening in people's lives. But, it's the brain's extremely complicated, and there's, I think, a growing appreciation that, yes, we can influence things in the right direction, but actually how you choose to try to train stuff is kind of a difficult question, much more than just like getting someone's brain towards the norm. And most peak performers, like most elite founders, I don't, I hate using that word peak performer, but it's like people who are passionate, who are doing stuff in this world, don't have average brains.
No.
Sorry.
No. And if you're going to train them towards normal, you would have just eviscerated any kind of, golden nuggets that's responsible for that drive, that's responsible for that innovative thinking, that's responsible for that extraordinary behavior. I mean, ordinary people don't just go create startups. I agree with you. That they go get a job and get paid very well and go home and, have their family life and, 2.5 kids and white picket fans. That's normal. But, I think evolution, has always been moved forward by having those who are quote unquote normal, but also having those who are outliers, right? People who have sort of outlier-ish brain metrics, EEG signatures. We have a large customer that has collected a massive amount of data working with elite athletes, right? So these are quarterbacks, star quarterbacks in top NFL teams, NCAA teams, baseball, hockey, golf, you name it. And what they found is, there are extraordinary markers in the sort of higher beta range that would, in a normative clinical context, easily be mistaken as anxiety, right? So how do you skin that? A normative approach will say, well, you get rid of that because that's anxiety. That doesn't, but like you said yourself, which I fully agree, a nuanced clinician was, 4 years education from Sabre, such as yourself, will say, wait a minute, we need to understand why these things are there. What are they doing? Is this working for the individual? Or is this harming them, right? Like, what's the sort of relational piece there? And if it's working for them, why do we want to get rid of that? But if it's like making them burn out and irritable and, it's hurting their relationships and their social stuff, let's modulate that. Let's tune it down by configuring it differently, but it's not like, let's cut it out altogether. But, so there really is that nuance, which I think that you can't replace with AI just yet. There has to be a relational piece. Unless, one day AI can fully understand everything that's affective, which I think we're still ways away from. So the good neurofeedback, in my opinion, has to be done by well-trained, knowledgeable clinicians that can think 360 with the right tools. That doesn't hurt. I mean, but tools aren't just going to do everything. I use AI to code, but that doesn't mean that every code I write is coming from an AI. I use the right requirement structure. I feed it good stuff. I check its work. I test it. That's still very much human work. Just because I can do more with AI, it doesn't mean AI is replacing me as a technologist or a developer, right? At least not yet. But there's very much this key emphasis on the human intervention, a responsible human intervention that we mustn't forget.
That's right. We're never going to replace people. And I think there's so much promise in incorporating these different AI tools, but we're only scratching the surface as far as different ways that we can optimize people's brain function and lived experience in ways that are both, evidence-based and science-backed, and also in ways that are counterintuitive, and especially within like the peak performance type of applications. There's so many ways that we can enhance function that there just aren't scientific studies about because you can't find a cohort really yet, at least not yet, of people with like these unique brains that we're coming across. And that's what's exciting about it. It's like there's an element of adventure in training your brain when you've already sort of when you're already a person who is not typical.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
100%.
well, thanks so much for your time, Alex. We got so much stuff in the works, and I appreciate everything that you've been developing. And I know you'll be back at some point soon. Where can folks find out more about you online?
Sure. The pleasure is all mine. Thanks for having me. It's always good to touch base. I appreciate your wisdom and all the work that you're doing in the community, and your collaboration is always has been invaluable to us to help us get better and go the right direction. You can find out more about us on www.divergence neuro. That's divergenceneuro.com. You can also follow us on LinkedIn, Instagram, X, or Facebook at Divergence Neuro, same spelling. Thank you very much for your conversation. Thank you for some of those excellent questions and discussion points. I've really enjoyed our discussion as always.
Yeah, man, me too. It's been a delight, and I love that you bring this really wide range of expertise and experience into this. And, you have many thanks from my end because I was a clinician using all those old tools. And it's a fantastic tool to be able to implement high quality neurofeedback remotely with a tablet or a phone from home. It frees up so much of my bandwidth to be able to do my work and innovate. So, onwards and upwards.
I love it. Yeah, we love hearing that at any time. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thanks for listening to EEG World, y'all. And if you have any questions, Alex will be back in the future, I hope. And they're innovating a lot of stuff. So if you have requests about what we can discuss in the future, or even feature requests or questions, put them in the comments below. We'll see you soon.